Hi, good evening. This presentation is in English, but you can also very well pose your questions in Spanish, no problem at all. My name is Lynn Caroline Broker, and I'm a PhD student at the Department of Communication at the University Pompeu Fabra. The research project is the 30% European content and a study on the policy and news media frames regarding the AVMSD, the Audiovisual Media Service Directive of 2018. The research topic, in more concrete terms, the role of the algorithmic content display in relation to the concept cultural diversity, with regard to the video on demand services in the context of European Union policies. So we have the AVMSD on the one hand, the VOD service providers, and the concepts algorithmic content display and cultural diversity. Two very interesting stats to situate the research project a little bit more would be that, VOD, video on demand service providers have absolutely disrupted the markets. While European TV broadcasters invest around 20% on their revenues in original content, those figures presented less than 1% for VOD providers in 2022. And also the growth rate, on the other hand, of subscription VOD services, like Netflix, for instance, had increased 30-fold over the past 10 years. So a massive trajectory. That status as well from 2021. There have been an even more massive acceleration during COVID, and then we saw a decline with now a stagnation, but the general tendency is clear. It is a significant growth and a development. The compound annual growth rate was 40% in 2020, and we're speaking about a sector of 11.6 billion. So the AVMSD was published in 2018, ratified in 2018, and I'm primarily looking at the 30% European content quota. There are obviously other policy measures which will be tackled as well, but the 30% European content quota with regard to the concepts cultural diversity and algorithmic display of content is particularly interesting. With regard to the research questions, we have research question 1. What frames can be located within the EU policy documents on the AVMSD dealing with the VOD quota implemented in 2018, and how do they relate to the concepts cultural diversity and algorithmic display of content? And another research question has been formulated to be, to what extent can the frames located in the EU policy documents on the AVMSD be located as well in the news articles from France, Germany, and Spain, and how do those frames relate to the concepts, to the before mentioned concepts in the news frame context? I've analyzed France, Germany, and Spain because we here have very similar audiovisual market realities, and also 2 newspapers per country, so 6 in total, and the newspapers were also chosen to be similar in terms of market share and ideology. The research context, it's probably important to mention that the 30% European content quota is based on titles, while European qualifies as a product, so in this case a movie or a documentary or series originated in one of the EU member states, or that it was co-produced with a European member state in broad terms. And then with regard to the concept cultural diversity, so how it has been conceptualized and operationalized within this research is very much tied to the definition given by the European Union currently in the UNESCO Convention in 2005, And in really high-level terms, we're talking about the variety of cultural expression and creative results, products, the different cultural practices, identities, representations, and storytelling within a society. It is an absolute important and central concept to the formation of the European Union ever since, and was also found recognition in the motto United in Diversity. It is cultural diversity in general within the cultural policies of the EU has been examined by different scholars. Culture and also cultural diversity is a very complex concept. However, there have been some frameworks to define cultural diversity, and one scholar would be Napoli, which defines source diversity, content diversity, and exposure diversity. And the cultural diversity concept with regard to nowadays algorithmic content display is a really interesting aspect. I'm looking at algorithms from a social technical perspective, basically in line with Gillespie's definition, and again brought in defined down into very general terms. We're looking at the automatic input of information and the systematic processing of information in order to give back an optimized ranked output of information. So we are speaking about optimized information towards consumer needs, and this process is potentially interfering with the cultural diversity objective at the exposure level. With regard to the methodology, the tool MaxQDA has been utilized for a exploratory coding phase, and followed by a systematic frame analysis in line with the previous work by Entman and Van Gorp. In particular, Van Gorp's frame metric framework has been used to extrapolate frame packages. And with regard to the before mentioned research question 1, I've analyzed a corpus of 8 European Union policy documents, the directive itself, press releases, but also guidelines in addition to the directive. And with regard to research question 2, that research phase consisted of a corpus of finally 130 for news articles from the dominant newspapers from France, Germany, and Spain that were published during a given time frame. With regard to the results, 4 main frame clusters were located at policy level. One was sector protection, the other consumer protection, cultural diversity, and algorithmic manifestation. And under those clusters, a total of 10 frames were located. The reinvestment of a percentage of revenue into the production of European content, the protection of the local audiovisual sector, the protection of the European audiovisual sector, the protection of consumers, combating hatred, prejudice, or discrimination. Another frame was the preservation of cultural diversity, pluralism, multiculturalism, or interculturalism, the protection of the co-official languages, and protection of heritage, and ultimately algorithmic tagging and display of content just as editorial responsibility. So in really global terms, the 10 policy frames were 10 in total were located also in the news level. However, frames were picked up in nuanced ways, and essentially they were localized in line with the historical and current audiovisual policy context. As an example, with regard to the cultural diversity frame, So the French news articles primarily highlighted the importance of cultural diversity for democracy. The German news articles tended to focus on the content diversity as a prerequisite to ensure market share and competitiveness towards foreign production. And the Spanish articles highlighted the diversity in the sense of, on the one hand, the diverse production and financing of European content, and then also, particularly as for the articles from La Vanguardia, referencing the need for cultural diversity in the sense of safeguarding content in the co-official languages. Generally, the frame algorithmic tagging and display of content showed very low occurrences in terms of frequency of code, and it was not a news topic in terms of critical discussion. Now we're looking at those particular news articles that were dealing with the AVMSD, right? And again, on global terms, the results, the data pointed to results that highlighted that cultural diversity was an underlying moral justification to mainframes, even if cultural diversity was not the mainframe in itself, and a secondary goal, for instance, next to protecting the European audiovisual sector, a byproduct. Cultural diversity remains very vaguely conceptualized. It's a regulatory objective, clearly formulated, but conceptually and operationally poorly defined and underexplored. Then with regard to the concept of algorithmic content display, the opportunities and threats of the digital era were mentioned on the policy document level, but no policy measure actually tackled the algorithmic question. The AVMSD has a policy measure that is an obligation for securing prominence of European work, but the actual concept prominence is also not further defined. And that would be it. Thank you very much for your attention.